Good morning and welcome to Criminal Justice Insider. I'm BABZ RAWLS-IVY.
And I'm Jeff Grant.
Oh, and we are sponsored by the Community Foundation of Greater New Haven.
Now more than ever.
So today our guest is, let's see, I have notes here.
Number two.
Number two. All right. Our guest today is Peter J Henning. He's a professor of law at Wayne State University, Indiana, and a white-collar watch communist.
That's fantastic.
I hope he's not listening. Columnist.
That's fantastic.
Columnist for the New York Times.
He might be a communist. We'll have to ask him.
So we're going to bring him on now so we can talk. But hey, Jeff, how are you?
Good, Babs. How you doing?
How was your drive in this morning?
Well, since there was no snow this morning.
Until you got to New Haven.
Yeah, you know, we're going to put Lynn up for Weathercaster at Channel 8 this morning, because her whole motto is open the window and see what's going on.
That's my motto, too. So I looked out, I was like, oh, there's a little bit of snow. And then I got your text this morning. I was like, okay, let me go look out the window. So
let's hear our shout outs to Andrew Kaplan.
Hey, Andrew Kaplan.
And Lynn. And,
hey, Lynn.
And also Karen Henning, Peter's wife, who's in Connecticut this weekend for her camp reunion. So
all right.
There's a big shout out, you know.
And we have his picture up on our Facebook feed and our Twitter feed and all our feeds.
Yeah, let's hope she gets back to Indiana safely.
All right. So I can unmute this now.
Yep.
Okay. Harry? Okay, let me see. Is it unmuted? Good morning. I said good morning. Oh, it's not up. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
Hey,
welcome
Peter.
to our show, Peter.
Oh, well, thank you. And I'm not a communist.
I didn't think you...
I have to make one teeny correction. Wayne State is in Michigan, not
See, whose
sorry.
notes are these?
Oh, I blew it. I'm so sorry.
I just read what I'm told, Peter.
I understand. No, it's just, I'd rather not be associated with any state that Bobby Knight coached in.
Well, to us New Englanders, it's all the same out there in the Midwest.
I understand. I have plenty of relatives in Milford. From you. And
just a stone's
my parents
throw.
were born and raised in Worcester.
Oh, so you are a New Englander, really?
By roots, yes. My mother never called me Peter. I was always Peta.
Oh, there you go.
See, look at that.
Oh no, I can do a New England accent.
You can park the car in Worcester.
Oh yeah, Pockeycott, Harvard Yard.
Yeah.
Oh,
he's good. He's good.
That's good. That's good. Well, welcome to our
for years when I was growing up.
Welcome to our show, Peter. We're delighted to have you, so we can talk about this whole world of criminal justice and the work that you've done covering cases. I believe white-collar crimes.
Oh, yeah. Peter's an expert in white-collar and all kinds of other criminal justice. But we'll let him give his bio a little bit. The bio is at number 7 if you're interested, Babs. But I became aware of Peter because he writes this fantastic, even-handed, thorough, well-written column for the New York Times deal book called White Collar Watch, which everybody in the industry reads. And so we started correspondence a few years ago, and Peter was kind enough to come on. Peter, is that fair?
That's fair. I view the column as a teaching tool. I don't try to ever stake out a position that someone is either guilty or not guilty, because I don't make that decision. Neither does the public. But it's essentially to, what a New York Times story can cover in one paragraph, I can do in 1,000 words, because it's sometimes interesting to go into a little bit more depth on what's required, especially in white-collar crime, because these are all cases that revolve around intent. I've always said I've never heard an alibi defense in a white-collar case. I wasn't the CEO of the company. I have never heard offered. So it really all comes down to, can you prove what was in the defendant's mind? And that's a challenge. That's not an easy thing to do, certainly.
Well, Peter, what brought you to this? I mean, it seems a little bit of a niche for anyone to be involved in. So what brought you to it?
Well, back long ago in a galaxy far away, I started in the 1980s at the SEC, back when the big name was Ivan Boesky or Michael Milken, although I didn't work on either of those cases, thankfully. And then in 1990, after the S&L crisis hit, I switched over to the Department of Justice. I got hired there, I think because I could read a balance sheet, something most lawyers are never taught to do.
That's for sure.
So I did. I spent 3.5 years working on bank fraud cases in New England, actually.
Wow.
I got to see an awful lot of Massachusetts, a little bit of Vermont, and a slice of New Hampshire, because I don't know if, I don't think many people remember the S&L crisis, but everybody thought, well, it was just Texas. No, it hit savings and loans everywhere. Remember, Bank of Boston got hit hard. Trying to think.
Wasn't that the Lincoln? Wasn't that Lincoln Savings Bank? Wasn't that?
Well, Lincoln Savings was in Southern California,
Yeah.
although they were mostly centered in Arizona. Lincoln was one. Then in Texas, you had some really flamboyant things. But if you follow what happened in New England, they had these 5-cent savings banks, which were mostly ethnic savings banks, catering to the different ethnic groups, and they were small S&Ls. And in the late 1980s, everyone thought, oh, wouldn't it be great? Property prices will never go down. And so they started lending like there was no tomorrow. And then they got caught when the economy went into a downturn. And so there were any number of cases. Bankers will follow the latest trend. And so what you had at that time, you got them again in 2008, what we called liar loans. It's where the bank did no verification. So if you told me your income was $100,000, I said, great, thank you, here's your loan.
Wow.
Which is a phenomenally stupid thing to do.
So Peter,
that happened again in 2007 and 2008 with the subprime loans.
Sure. Peter, why do you think
lending out money because they had lots of it, and if you don't do any verification, people will figure out a way to take advantage of it.
Peter, why do you think that
there was how I got into this? And I got into teaching in 1994, and I started teaching a class called white-collar crime, and I looked around. There were 10 law schools that offered it back in 1994. Now almost every law school has a course in white-collar crime because the big firms back in the early 90s stayed away from criminal cases because they were so unseemly. And then all of a sudden, the big firms figured out that white-collar crime is a license to print money. The firms can charge phenomenal amounts, and essentially, I always joke that the message to your client is, they said, look, I don't want to pay you all this money now, and then it's like, okay, let's wait until after you're indicted. That's not a good option. So these law firms now have figured out that they can charge just phenomenal amounts to conduct internal investigations, to defend people, and so it has become a real moneymaker for the law firms. And that's an interesting point. In the early 1990s,
I don't think we ever hear that. We never hear that part of it. Like we never hear the lucrative side for law firms. I never hear that.
Yeah, Peter.
Yeah,
Peter, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Peter, can you hear me?
The thing too is that it's we're addicted to wins and losses. Like the Patriots are in their 8th AFC championship game. If you look at some of the leading white-collar defense lawyers, they don't have a very good record. Defendants usually lose, but it never sticks to the lawyer. So the lawyer is, this is a leading white-collar practitioner. If you look at his or her record, they lose a lot of the cases, but they develop a good reputation as a vigorous advocate. And so now you're starting to see lawyers charging upwards of $2,000 an hour in white-collar cases.
Okay, so what's your question, Jeff?
Peter, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So,
yes.
Peter, why do you think that? Because you mentioned the 2008 recession and the bank, as you call them, liar loans. Why do you think that there were so few prosecutions relating to that, and then why did the government, and probably most notably the Southern District of New York, Preet Bharara's office, go after insider trading with such a vengeance when this huge mortgage crisis was right in front of everyone's eyes?
Yeah, it's a good question, because the cases involving subprime loans, or it was really not so much the subprime loans themselves, but it was when they were securitized, which means you take a bunch of subprime loans, which are not very good loans to make. They have a default rate that is fairly substantial, but somehow Wall Street figured out that if you put a bunch of them together, you can turn it into a good security that a bunch of people will buy. The problem with that type of case is it is incredibly resource intensive. It requires an enormous amount of time. Essentially, you've got to dig through hundreds, maybe even thousands of loans, versus an insider trading case. I always describe insider trading as the low-hanging fruit of the securities world. They're fun cases. They're not very difficult. Once you put together the source of the information and the trading, and they make headlines. So you get Raj Rajaratnam arrested and being marched through the streets in handcuffs, with Special Agent B.J. Kang next to him with his crew cut. That made the headlines. A 4-year investigation of a mid or upper level banker is almost going to draw a shrug. People are going to go, "Oh, I never heard of him." Whereas you arrest a billionaire, or at least a reputed billionaire,
sure,
and that makes the front page of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. So insider trading is, if you will, sexy.
That's a good point, because there's a lot of white collar crimes that go unpublicized, right? Like, we only hear about the biggest of the biggest crimes.
Certain. You only hear about the biggest, and it's only if there's someone very prominent. So in public corruption cases, you see the government going after elected officials. Here in Detroit, the former mayor here, Kwame Kilpatrick, sat through a 6-month trial. I mean, that was just every day was in the headlines because he was the former mayor. If you go after a small town city council member, it's almost going to be like, oh, yeah, that doesn't draw a lot of attention.
Oh, I don't know, because I was a small town. Well, I was a city council member, and I was on the front page just about every day for like weeks. So it was really. So I think I'm the exception and not the rule, because I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
Right, and it's I mean, I think prosecutors do try to get the headline case. Certainly, the IRS does that. The IRS makes it well known that if you're famous and we find issues with it, we're going to go after you, because their view is that you get deterrence through publicity. It tells people, be careful. Now, I can give you my views on deterrence in white collar crime, but that's they're going for the publicity hit.
So that's why Martha Stewart got tapped the way she did?
I'm sorry?
Is that why Martha Stewart caught it the way she did? I mean,
boy, you say Martha Stewart, she was so well known at the time, and if you look at what everybody goes, well, they got Martha Stewart on insider trading. No, they didn't. Martha Stewart was convicted of making false statements to the FBI. She went in to explain her trading and sat down with the FBI and the SEC, and then was not entirely truthful about the trading that she had engaged in and the information that she got. So it was in the vicinity of insider trading, but actually it's a crime that we've seen most recently. For example, Michael Flynn, Michael Cohen. I think there are others who were charged with it's called Section 1001. It's the lying to the federal government, and that includes lying to an FBI agent. Even though FBI agents expect to be lied to every time they talk to someone, it's still a crime. So whoever tells the truth to the police, it's like who tells the truth to their parents? If you've had a teenager, you assume the teenager is lying, but it can also get you sent to prison.
What's the guidelines range for lying to your parents, Peter?
I can tell you, as a parent, take things away and never be seen again for a good while.
So Peter, why don't we go to some like kind of big headline that's out there right now? Because obviously there's a lot of white collar issues around Trump and George Papadopoulos and Paul Manafort. And Paul Manafort's a Connecticut guy, so at least our Connecticut listeners might be interested in like what are the white collar issues relating to all of this, and is this really another example of prosecutors climbing the corporate ladder to get to the big guy?
Certainly, that's how when you build a case, you start with the lower rungs. And so you try to bring some pressure on the lower rung people to work your way up. Paul Manafort is fairly high up on the food chain. The challenge in white-collar cases is often convincing the target of the investigation that they actually did something wrong. I think most of us are very good at convincing ourselves that we didn't do anything wrong, so that getting someone to realize that what they did was illegal after they've spent months or even years convincing themselves they didn't do anything wrong. That's how you build your case, and oftentimes I found this out. I always thought it was fascinating. I wanted the target of the investigation to have a good lawyer. I didn't want a bad lawyer on the other side. I wanted a good lawyer who I could show our evidence to and say, look, I think we're going to win this at trial, and they could then convince their client, if you go to trial, you're going to pay a real penalty here. It's well known, there is a trial penalty. If you go to trial, the judge is going to hammer you. Is that fair? It's the reality. And so, that's how you build your case, but you're dealing with someone who oftentimes does not think he or she did anything wrong. And I still remember when I was in Boston, I was talking with one of their drug people, and he said, well, just get them in a room and force them to confess. And I'm like, you can't do that. Dealing drugs is obviously illegal. No one ever says, well, heroin's illegal? I didn't know that. Whereas, you made this loan. Well, I don't think I did anything wrong with it. How do you convince someone that what they did was improper? And that's not an easy thing to do. And that's why you saw Paul Manafort went to trial. It was after that first trial that I think his lawyer sent him a message going, you don't want to go 0 for 2. That's not a good position to be in. And so it's time to cut your deal, although now Mr. Mueller's shop is saying that he lied to them. And that's an even stupider thing to do.
So, Peter, where does this end? I'm not convinced that Manafort operated as a lone agent. I think he was taking his directions from whoever he was taking his directions from. So does the prosecutorial team follow this to the end, or do they say, you know what, we got our guy, we're done? How does this play out? Because I'm thinking somebody directed him to do these things. He didn't do these things in isolation.
No, certainly not. And but what they focus the Manafort case on is, and this is true in white collar cases, you pick out the case that you think is the easiest one to win. There it was he didn't file the proper tax forms. He got large amounts of money through the banks in Cyprus. You build your case that way, and then try to get more, because you're right. I mean, Paul Manafort was the campaign manager for President Trump. He was not. They called Papadopoulos. What was he? He got coffee for them. Although there's some pictures of him not getting coffee, but sitting with important people. But it's one of those situations that you pick out the case that you can win, and then say, fine, tell us more.
Because the optics on this, Peter, for the president is pretty bad, even though the administration has tried to distance themselves from saying, well, he was the campaign manager. Now they're saying, well, he really wasn't the campaign manager. He was like around, but he didn't really do any heavy lifting and that kind of thing. So the optics are bad, but they're trying to change the narrative of that. And it seems to, it doesn't seem to be leading back to the president. Like, people are still not making those connections and threads.
Well, and that's we saw Rudy Giuliani's recent comment that he goes, well, there was some collusion, but it didn't involve the president. And that's always the challenge, to go back to Jeff's question earlier, out of the financial crisis, everybody said, well, why don't we see a bank CEO being charged with a crime? Getting to the CEO is very difficult. Getting to Donald Trump is very difficult, because those top-level people don't get their hands dirty. It's hard to get their fingerprints on either the messages or the transactions that are important. So, everybody points to that June 2016 meeting at Trump Tower, at which his son and Jared Kushner and Paul Manafort attended with the Russian attorney, and Donald Trump wasn't there. And so what are you going to be able to show was in Trump's mind? And that's what goes back to, again, these cases are really about intent and knowledge and involvement. How are you going to show President Trump, especially when he is, in fairness to him, he's the big picture guy. He's not going to, he doesn't tap out emails. I don't know if he even sends emails. He sends out enough tweets, but those don't say anything.
So, Peter, but what happens when seemingly the standard keeps changing? Let's take a line of cases like Martoma, Newman, Salmon, and now the Chris Collins case, the politician in Buffalo, where the behavior could be similar, but the standard of what's a crime or not seems to continue to change.
That's a good one.
And it certainly does. In insider trading, it looked like it was going to be harder to prove a case in the Second Circuit, which covers Connecticut and, more importantly, Manhattan, for insider trading cases. It looked like they were going to raise the standard. And then the Supreme Court lowered it a notch in the Salmon case. And then in the recent decision in United States versus Martoma worked for Stephen Cohen, and that case involved over $250 million in gains and losses avoided. The Second Circuit essentially said, you know what, it's not a very high standard here to show that one person tipped off another. The complaint about insider trading law is that it's all judge-made. There is no law on the books anywhere that says insider trading is illegal.
Really?
It was created in the late 1960s.
I had no idea.
It's part of the the provision that it comes in under is Section 10B of the Securities Act, and then Rule 10b-5, which says don't engage in fraud. And so you have this crime that has been created. The complaint is made out of whole cloth, but that it is developed exclusively by the judges. And the Supreme Court has taken four major insider trading cases, and each time it has said, here's the law. And so we have judge-made law, and of course judge-made law means that, my position is 80% of insider trading fits comfortably within the definition, but it's the 10% on either side where it gets difficult. So, for example, Congressman Collins from upstate New York is saying he's going to fight it and claim he didn't give his son any information. The problem in insider trading cases is now for defendants is that the narrative is so powerful. You generally have wealthy people on trial, and juries don't necessarily like wealthy people. Prosecutors know to try to get a blue-collar jury, and they're not going to react very well to people saying, well, I didn't really violate the law. If you make a lot of money, you're starting off with pretty much of an 0-2 count if you're a baseball fan.
But doesn't this change now? Doesn't that narrative change now that we have a president who is supposedly a billionaire and can say, I can stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I can still, be free and be elected and all this other kind of stuff. So, do you think that the populace has changed their mind about just that kind of thing? Like they sort of give rich people more passes than they would, say, some black kid dealing drugs on the south side of Chicago kind of thing?
Oh, sure. The kid dealing drugs is, that's an easy case. White-collar cases are always much more complicated. But, once prosecutors put that case together, oftentimes wealth works against a defendant. That it gets portrayed, and this is true in white-collar cases, but even in other types of fraud cases, it's that you were greedy and rich people just want to make more money. That can be a fairly powerful narrative for the government, that prosecutors will rely on greed and say, look, this is someone who cut corners just to get richer. And of course, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, like any number of federal workers are at the moment, you're not going to be very favorable to that person. At least I don't think. The poor kid on the street selling drugs, as a defense lawyer, I would try to think, well, how am I going to defend that case? He had a bad upbringing, and this was all he could do to make money. That's not really much of a defense, at least normally in court, and a lot of judges just won't allow it.
So, Peter, what's your view of federal asset freezes, and what's the current standard, and isn't it a failure of due process in some ways? These are in many cases not only the actor's money is frozen, but his family's money, his wife's money is frozen. Is it a way for prosecutors to prevent defendants from getting fair counsel?
Well, certainly asset forfeiture has turned out to be a very powerful tool. Now, there was, on the civil side, back around 2000, you had a law called the Civil Asset Forfeiture Reform Act. And that was, interestingly, was pushed by the Republican Party at the end of Bill Clinton's term. But in the criminal sphere, asset forfeiture is an incredible weapon because it lets prosecutors go out and freeze assets that they say are traceable to the crime. And so it also lets prosecutors not only freeze assets, but say, look, you've got to come into court and prove these are untainted assets. Well, that's not an easy thing to do. And, excuse me, especially if the defendant it was engaged in, you see this typically in the drug cases or illegal weapons cases. The defendant then is left having to essentially tell the government, here's my defense to the crime, and try to convince a judge not to freeze your assets. And it puts you in a very bad position. But as a prosecutor, what they love to come in and say is, look, if you rob a bank, you can't use the money that you stole from the bank to defend yourself.
Sure.
And that's a standard refrain going, you can't use the proceeds of crime to defend yourself. So the thief doesn't then get to say, well, let me use the money that I stole from you. And that, again, puts defendants in a difficult position. I don't want anyone to think that being a defendant is at all easy. I mean, you can watch the Showtime, is it Billions?
Yes, I love that show.
The program. Yeah,
that's a Connecticut show, too.
Back and forth, and it is about 2% of reality.
Yeah, sure.
And you root for the bad guys. Like, you find yourself rooting for the bad guys.
Well, who's the bad guy here?
Well,
they're all bad guys.
Yeah, you got a lot of bad guys.
Everybody's a bad guy.
I mean, it's got wonderful actors, and it's a fun show, but it is not the way life is. You guys know what it's like to be accused of a crime.
Sure.
I mean, it is so destructive. And when I was a prosecutor, I didn't really understand it until I had a case once involving a lawyer who he essentially had brokered some deals. And the question was, do we charge him or not? And I finally sat down with my supervisor and said, I think we can get a civil settlement out of him, and that's probably going to be good enough. And so he and his lawyer came in, and I delivered the good news, and he burst into tears. And I had never seen that before. But, here he was living with this sort of Damocles over his head. And, are they going to charge me with a crime? Because if we charged him with a crime, his life is destroyed.
Sure.
And I wonder sometimes whether prosecutors really understand that.
Peter,
the destructive nature of a criminal charge.
Yeah, Peter, I don't think that many people, certainly our listeners, understand that, these are really tragic human stories with a lot of difficult family issues and families that are in stages of disrepair and they're splitting up, and that the overwhelming majority of white-collar crimes and white-collar crime prosecutions are really for so-called normal people or against normal people, not these, sensationalized headline types. And it's, lawyers or doctors or nurses or whoever. And that we host an online white-collar support group on Monday nights. And if anyone's listening out there, you want information, just email me. And almost no one on that call is anyone you would have seen or would see on CNBC. I mean, these are people in very difficult circumstances, none of whom were rich. I mean, they were they were working privileged, probably. I mean, people who had to work every day, but certainly not wealthy.
No, and what often gets overlooked is the impact on the family. That just any criminal charge, you're going to get fired from your job, and no one is going to be helping you, and on spouses, on children, it can be so destructive. But at the same time, in the white collar area, you don't want to give people a free pass because you're a typical middle class person. It's a tough decision to make whether to pursue charges because it does cause so much trouble for the family. And I don't know how well, certainly when I was a prosecutor, I didn't quite understand it until toward the end of my time there, that it just, the devastating effect that it can have on a family, that it's, all of a sudden, it was easy for me in cases if I had never met the defendant, because it was just, it's that bad guy, I don't know anything about him. All of a sudden, you file the charge, and in court is the person's husband or wife and kids, and you look at him and you go, geez, what did I just do?
So, Peter, do you think should we be thinking about these kinds of cases as good versus bad or good versus evil? Like, is there room in the narrative for that kind of thinking, or do we really look at these things case by case by case?
Well, I mean, I certainly think it's more case by case. They at least in the white-collar area, and the kind of people I dealt with when I was a prosecutor, or that I see now and talk to, they're not evil people. For example, there's a case out of New York that the government's going to retry, an insider trading case. Sean Stewart is the defendant. They have a recording in which his father claims that the son said, I gave you this information on a silver platter. Why didn't you trade on it? Sean Stewart is you would love to have him as your next-door neighbor.
Sure.
A nice, good person. Were there issues? I would love to have you guys as my next-door neighbor. That's what makes these cases so.
We're not coming to Michigan, Peter.
No. Well, I was going to say you get more snow than we do. Or if you go back to, there was somebody from Connecticut, Rajat Gupta, who was caught up in the Rajaratnam insider trading case. He was convicted of being a tipper for Rajaratnam when he was on the board at Goldman Sachs. And one of the things that I spoke with one of the prosecutors afterwards and said he was one of the kindest, gentlest people I have ever met. Every morning he would say good morning to the prosecutors. These are people trying to put him in jail. And he was unfailingly polite to them, as was his family. And, one of the prosecutors said this was really hard when they got to sentencing, because he's like, look, this is not a bad guy.
Well,
Peter, how do I
Peter,
portray him?
Peter, how much of all of this is really just kind of an extension of the new Jim Crow, in that it's really people making money on the backs of other people, or their misfortune or their weakness, and whether it be business people casting out.
Well, I don't think you can use the new Jim Crow in this regard, because the new Jim Crow is specific about race and ethnicity, about race. No, so you can't use that in these particular. I don't think that's a fair.
No, but I am talking about people making money or building their careers on the backs of other people.
Yeah, but that's not a new Jim Crow kind of thing. Okay. No, it isn't, because I don't want us to lose sight of race and the weight that race plays in criminal cases across
that's fair.
Across the board.
That's fair, but still, but the question is, how much of this is people making money on the backs of other people, and not just warehousing people in prisons. I'm talking about taking advantage of people who are vulnerable, and whether it be prosecutors or other business people or anyone in the chain, where they're going to cast out the weak, and maybe even for a reason so that the spotlight won't be on them themselves.
Well, there's the Department of Justice has an interesting approach now to companies, where they have said that companies have to identify culpable individuals if they want credit for cooperating with us. In other words, trying to get a free pass, or at least try to mitigate any fine or penalty that would be imposed. And you notice what that does. It gives the company an incentive to throw a few employees under the bus or throw them to the wolves, whatever analogy you want to use. And it's rarely the top-level people. It is most often the middle manager who gets identified. And if you've worked in a corporate structure, you understand, too, the pressure that's on you to perform. You've got to come in and meet this month's or this quarter's earnings or revenue or whatever number you've got to hit. And where you see any number of white-collar crime cases developing is people cut a few little corners, and then, you're just kind of pushing it down the road. Oh, don't worry, we'll do better in the next quarter or the next year. And then all of a sudden, the whole process takes on a life of its own. And so I don't think many people wake up in the morning saying, it's a beautiful Friday in Connecticut, I'm going to go commit a white-collar crime. At least I hope not. I think it's white-collar crimes are often just a series of small steps. So sometimes it'll be on the backs of others, but sometimes it's just, look, I've got to do this. This is, my self-image is wrapped up in my job.
And that's a good point, Peter, because that whole Ponzi scheme thing, what's their names? The folks who got caught up in
Madoff?
Yeah, the Madoff folks, the Madoff family. That's how he sort of addressed, like, it started off as this small thing, or it started off as this one thing, and before he knew it, he just had to keep it all going. I'm not trying to make I'm not making excuses. I'm just saying I see what you're saying about one thing can lead to another, and before you know it, it becomes a life of its own.
And a lot of times you see that in smaller businesses. One of the key crimes is embezzlement. That you have that one key employee who takes a little bit and then a little bit, and then all of a sudden, after 5 years, you look back and you go, wait a minute, that was $800,000. We have a church here near me where the bookkeeper stole almost $1 million. But it was over 10 years. And so it was just these little small amounts. And the person said, look, I got in over my head. What was I going to do? Now, I'm always a little fearful with Bernie Madoff because I think he was a sociopath. But,
I agree with you. I just heard him say that it
started small.
It started small, and then he just he didn't turn around, like he didn't shut it down. He just kept going with it.
So Peter, how much of this is a failure to teach real ethics and character building, either from a young age societally or even right in the business schools, like
right.
And have we relegated too much self-policing of what constitutes ethics to the business schools instead of really teaching them right and wrong?
I always view it. You hope someone has the right moral compass, but sometimes people lose sight of it. I don't know if it's so much a teaching failure as that. A lot of the white-collar crimes are, I've got an opportunity here, and I'm going to take advantage of it, and no one will notice me.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And small scale.
And I'll tell you this, Peter. I don't think by the time you get to business school, if you don't know right and wrong, then I don't think business school is the place that's going to give it to you. I think what happens in some of these cases, and I can only speak to myself, when you stand on the intersection of opportunity and desperation, that's when bad things can happen, right? That's when bad decisions and bad choices can happen. And I think people find themselves standing on that very corner of desperation and opportunity, and then with the belief that, at some point they could go back and correct this or fix this.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? And so...
And I'm not a bad person. And I really do think that's right, that they're not at their core evil, but you end up making choices that come back to haunt you. I always use the phrase, you don't ever have to say stupid teenager, just say teenager, because they're all stupid, or they all do stupid things.
Don't I know it.
I had 3 teenage girls in my house at one point.
I
was told I was so stupid.
I've got 4. Well, 2 boys and 2 girls.
But Peter, Babs used the word desperation, but how much of this, along with desperation, I mean, my experience is that there's underlying causes for a lot of this behavior, being mental illness or drug and alcohol abuse, or kind of bad family dynamics, whether in the family of origin or in their current family, where the men, I'm saying men because in most part it's men, but they, they've become kind of caught up in a narcissistic system, and it makes them abandon their primary relationship with their wives, for example, which would, if healthy, it would serve as a check and balance against a lot of these things.
Right, and I always I teach the legal ethics course at my school, and I tell the students, I said, look, if you're thinking about doing something and you're concerned that it might not be proper, talk to someone else and put it in English. Just put it in ordinary, everyday. And if your statement to the other person is, well, I can steal the money and get away with it, guess what? That's wrong.
That's the wrong thing.
But I can come up with 30 different reasons why I deserve to get, I'm underpaid, I am overworked, and it's just the company, no one's going to notice. And all of a sudden, once you convince that person in the mirror, a lot of times it does become easier. But you're right that there is, I want to succeed at some place in my life. And if I have a bad family situation or dysfunction, I have a marriage going south, maybe this is where I can rebuild my ego, which is not a good thing to do, but how do people fall into that trap? They do. And it is unfortunate. But you guys know far better than I do the devastation it can cause in your life.
Yeah, Peter, with the hundreds of people I've worked with, almost all know on some level that they're reaching a tipping point, or they're being asked to do something that they shouldn't do, or they're asking themselves to do it, but they're afraid to go into the bedroom and be honest with their wife and say, listen, I'm either not the man I thought I was, or I'm not the earner that we thought I was, without doing things that are improper. And what we should really do right now is sell the house, sell the cars, downsize our life, and simplify. And I think that what most of them report is that the reason they don't do it is that they're afraid their wives are going to leave them, and primarily because they've abandoned their wives emotionally such a long time ago, and they're afraid their wives are only hanging around for the money.
Which is so unfortunate, but it's how many of us like to admit we're failures?
Yeah.
I have failed, and therefore, I've got to come up with some way to succeed. And so you find that sometimes these are crimes just of aggression, just a series of small steps that all of a sudden has become this. And I love the excuses. Well, everybody else in the industry does this.
Yeah.
You see that in the healthcare fraud cases. Oh, everybody's doing off-label prescriptions, and so I'm just doing what everyone else does, and it's not fair to pick on me. That excuse doesn't work. It's if you get on 95 and drive 80 miles an hour, you may well get a ticket. And but there was another guy driving 80 miles an hour. Yeah. Too bad.
And that is the lesson all parents try to impart. If somebody jumps off the bridge, are you going to jump off the bridge with them? No. So, yes.
No, please don't do that. that. But, then you say no to them, and you're told you're an idiot.
Yeah, well, there you go.
I was told I was an idiot so many times, I actually thought it was my middle name for a while.
Well, thank you, Peter. This has been a wonderful conversation. We have got to go, but we'd love to have you back.
Peter, how can people reach you if they want to talk about this more, or they want to write to you?
Easiest way to reach me is I'm old-fashioned email. My email is peter.henning, HENNING, at Wayne, WAYNE.edu.
In Michigan.
Very easy way to reach me. It's just wayne.edu, but yes, I'm in Michigan, Eastern time zone. And I certainly appreciate it, and I admire the work you guys are doing.
Thank you. Thank you for being our guest.
Important.
This was quite illuminating this morning. So thank you so much.
And drive safely.
Yeah, Peter, and to your wife who's here in Connecticut, get home before the snow on Sunday.
She's coming home Monday.
Oh,
gonna,
maybe.
Enjoy it. She's down near Old Saybrook.
Oh, okay, so that'll be pretty. Yeah. So, all right.
They can go hiking. They're by a lake. It's an Episcopal summer camp.
Oh, nice, lovely.
She gets to go back and visit. Always enjoy it, and they've got plenty of wine.
I like that. So, well, thank you so much. Thank you, Harry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Jeff.
Babs, love you, Babs.
And we'll back in 2 weeks.
2 weeks, February 1st.
Yes. So thank you so much.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Oh, we need to say today's show was brought to you by the Community Foundation of Greater New Haven.
Now more than ever.
Thank you.
We owe them too.